Welcome to Scary Diaries, where the line between the living and the dead blurs, and the ordinary turns into the horrifying. Unbridled, an espresso, still as natural flavors as the rich bests. Written by L.D. Tunnel. Tonight, we delve into the dark corners of a place meant for healing, the hospital. But not all who wander its halls are alive, and not all stories are meant to be told. Join us for The Midnight Ward, a terrifying tale of shadows, whispers, and the secrets that should have stayed buried. Dim the lights, put on your headphones, and prepare yourself. The story begins now. The story, The Midnight Ward. Alina had been a nurse for years, but nothing could prepare her for her new assignment at St. Mary's General Hospital. That's from the doctor. The hospital was notorious in the city, a relic of the past, with parts of the building abandoned after decades of decline. It operated with a skeleton crew, and most of the wards were shuttered due to budget cuts. Rumors of strange happenings filled its empty halls. It's just another hospital, Alina told herself as she walked in for her first night shift. The air inside felt different, cold, heavy, as though the walls themselves were watching. Her supervisor, Nurse Grayson, gave her a quick orientation. The ICU is the only active ward on the 3rd floor. Everything else is closed off. Stick to your rounds, and you'll be fine. Grayson's words were reassuring, but the look in her eyes wasn't. Elena's first few hours passed without incident. Most patients were stable and asleep, their monitors beeping softly in the quiet night. At midnight, as Elena walked past room 36, she felt a chill. She paused, noticing the door slightly ajar. The room was supposed to be vacant. What startled her was the blanket and the sheets. What had she just witnessed? Had Elena slept there? Pushing the door open, she found the bed empty and the lights off. But something felt wrong. Ayla paid attention to what she was seeing and flashed a light away until she saw enough of the room to hide in his flashlight. "Alina," a voice whispered from the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, her flashlight illuminating the empty room. The voice came again, softer but closer. "Elena." She bolted out of the room, her pulse racing. At the nurse's station, she reported the incident. Grayson frowned but said nothing, her expression grim. "Stick to your rounds," she finally said. By 2 a.m., Elena had calmed down, but the hospital felt colder, darker. As she checked patient charts, a faint knock echoed down the hallway. Curious, she followed the sound, which grew louder as she approached a set of locked double doors. A faded sign above them read, "Ward D, closed for renovation." The knocking stopped. Then she heard whispers. "Elena, come in." She backed away, her breathing shallow. Returning to the nurse's station, she asked Grayson about Ward D. "Forget about that place," Grayson snapped. "It's been closed for years. Don't go near it," said Siobhan. Elena nodded but couldn't shake her curiosity. Later that night, Elena's pager buzzed again. Room 306 needed assistance. Unless she found a way to escape from her cell, Alina would not be safe. Confused, she double-checked the chart. The room was listed as vacant. Still, she went to investigate. When she entered, the bed was made, but the monitor was on, its screen flickering. "Emanane." The whisper came again, this time louder. She turned and saw a figure standing in the corner. It was a man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes. He stared at her, his mouth moving soundlessly. Before she could react, the lights flickered and the figure vanished. She ran to the charge nurse, who looked alarmed. "Room 306, Grayson whispered. "That room has been empty since Mr. Carter died. There, he doesn't like to be disturbed." Unable to sleep after her shift, Elena searched the hospital archives. She found old records about Ward D. Years ago, it had been a psychiatric ward, treating patients with severe conditions. One patient Henry Carter, had been admitted after a violent episode. He died during an experimental procedure in room 306. Speaking on behalf of the court such as myself, let's borrow my patiences and escape into room 306. After his death, staff reported hearing his voice at night, calling for help. Patients claimed to see shadows and feel cold hands gripping their shoulders. Eventually, the ward was shut down after several staff members went missing. On her next shift, Elena couldn't resist. She took a flashlight and ventured into Ward D. The air was icy, and her footsteps echoed in the dark. Broken equipment and abandoned beds filled the space, and the walls were covered in graffiti and scratches. As she explored, she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she saw a wheelchair moving on its own. "Elena," the whisper came again. The sound led her to an old operating room. Inside, the temperature dropped further. On the surgical table lay a figure covered by a sheet. Her hands shook as she pulled back the sheet. The bed was empty. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. A shadowy figure appeared, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Eva slammed the door shut. "Trick or illusion? You shouldn't be here," it rasped. Elena screamed as the figure lunged toward her. She stumbled back, dropping her flashlight. Grabbing her phone, she turned on its flashlight and ran. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became deafening. The sound scares her further. Every time she thinks something can be done, she starts to believe it. She reached the locked doors and yanked them open, escaping into the main hallway. Grayson found her trembling at the nurse's station. "I told you not to go there," she said softly. Elena quit the next day. She moved to a different city, vowing never to step foot in a hospital again. She chose Montezino, but sometimes late at night, she hears the whispers. And when she looks in the mirror, she swears she sees a shadow behind her. End quote, Mirror. Next story. I was 18 and hadn't had much training yet. I was doing it overnight, but my resident was refusing to go to sleep. The man was a 6'5" beast, weighing in at almost 300 pounds. To my surprise, Jump Speed recognized the man emerged from the forest. He looked like a walking scimitar. He was missing an eye, he had put a pencil in it because the voices told him to, and his face was disfigured from a fire. He had multiple personalities, and often switched from normal to a fighter pilot, dropping bombs on those damn Japs in a matter of minutes. The first night I worked, he sat naked in his room most of the night, making bomb noises and yelling about Japs. He got quiet for a while and I started to drift to sleep. I suddenly wake up when I hear heavy breathing above me. It's my client, naked, holding a pudding cup. It was a perennial practice to hide the comings full of sex from Halsey. He looks me right in the eye and says, "You fall asleep again, and I'm going to kill you." He then sat in a chair in the living room, watching me until my relief came at 8 a.m. And in case anyone was wondering, this is a facility where the overnight staff are expected to sleep. It doesn't if it says, "I need to know your plans." And he tells me to get off. So I sat down at the control center and I stopped the car. I got paid minimum wage to do this shit. Number 5. One of my very best friends worked at one of the state hospitals here in California, and he told me a few that stuck out. Once, a client wasn't cooperating and they were trying to restrain him. He said that courts weren't allowed to enforce laws, and none such as stopping California for investigating numerous gunpoint outlets, rather than risk legal action. A number of the workers were attempting to hold him down. One of them had their hand on his chest. The guy lowered his head, bit off a part of the worker's finger, showed it to him on the tip of his tongue, and then swallowed it. Another had to wear a specially made helmet because he had a tendency to poke his finger in one of his eyes. He had done this so often that either he had pushed it up into his skull or it had been removed. On days that this client was well behaved, the staff would take the helmet off of him. One day, my buddy was watching him as he was playing a game with another client. He was losing and kept on getting more and more frustrated. When he finally lost, he started breathing really hard, and then all of a sudden, he jammed his finger as far as he can into his eye socket. The story that I found creepiest was after he was transferred to the more high-functioning area that was referred to as behind the fence. These were the guys that had committed some kind of crime and were eventually found to be criminally insane. Most of the guys there were guys that got caught up in gangs and tried to fight him any chance they had. There was one client there that was extremely nice to him, though. He described this guy as small, sweet, and a white guy. He said that he was amazed at how different this guy seemed to be, and he constantly wondered what he did to land in a mental hospital. Finally, one day, one of the staff members that had been there for years was working with him, and he decided to ask about this guy. The staff member tells him that this guy got into a fight with his roommate, killed him, cut him up, and placed him in a gym bag that he kept under his bed. I worked at a hospital doing transport for a couple of years. Charlene finished and leaned back in her chair, a smile crossing her lips. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all the laundry is done and supplies are also sorted there. I hated working late nights after this incident. On this particular night, I was the only one in the basement when I heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator. The dark whispering came from the other side of the building, and I turned and looked out. I poked my head around the corner, expecting to see my only coworker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. I shrugged it off. I'm not easily spooked. Nights are slow, so I ate some snacks and hung out in the break room for a bit. Already, 5 people had shown up, and there was almost as 1,000 excited. The next thing I know, though, I hear a loud bang. I walk into the hallway, and a bed is rolling down the hall, bumping into the sides. At this point, I think that my coworker is bullshitting me. I radio him, and he says he's upstairs in the cafeteria. I still don't believe him and think I'll catch him in the act. I walk past the laundry room and the machines start. I pop my head in there expecting to find him, but it's completely empty. The signs say, "Disabling system." Okay, I'm starting to get a little nervous now. I walk into the laundry room and the machines completely stop. I freeze, then run out and head towards the elevator, where I hear whistling again. In the waiting room, with its gray walls and haze, there is a faint orange-yellow light. At this point, I know I am the only worker in the basement. As I am standing there waiting for the elevator, things start falling off the shelves down the hall. Boxes of gloves, tissues, packages of tubes. I am literally standing there watching them fall off, one by one, at the opposite end of the hallway. I shit you not, my entire body broke out in goosebumps. My hair stood on end, and I had this strong gut feeling I was being watched, and I wasn't alone. As I'm getting into the elevator, I feel what feels like someone brushing my arm. I went upstairs and found my coworker in the cafeteria, and I freaked out to him. Halsey laughed and Boris smiled and nodded towards her. I got the fuck out of there and transferred soon after that. The creepy thing to add to it is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It was almost as if the spirit, or whatever the hell it was mimicking me. It was the creepiest feeling ever. The worst was after the nightly movie held in the cafeteria. 3 of us walked past the TV room with the nurse. Another patient was in there, and the nurse popped her head in to see who it was. The woman in the room was scratching the plexiglass box that the TV was enclosed in. Then, she immediately spun about in front of us. The room was pitch black. The nurse asked if she needed help. The woman just kept scratching. We had all walked into the room at this point, watching the woman scratch furiously at the plexiglass. The nurse asked again if she needed help, and the woman started screaming in some language that was clearly not English or Spanish, and scratching the plexiglass to the point where her hand was bleeding. Crouched down across from the woman, summarizing what happened to her, I relayed the information to the nurse. We had all walked into the room at this point when the woman scratched furiously at the plex, and the nurse, scratching the glass above the cut, started to argue with the woman that she needed to step back. The nurse started calling for assistance and trying to get the three of us out of the room when the woman turned towards us and screamed, "He's coming to eat your entrails tonight. All of you. He's gonna roast your skin over his fires." Justice looked back over at the undead nurse. Well, I noped it out of there and ran to the nurse's station. The other two patients split for their rooms, and the whole barrage of staff ran into the TV room to restrain the woman. I was so worked up, I practically begged the nurses to put me on a quarter 5. That's a check every 5 minutes by a staff member. I was on a quarter 30 at that point in my stay just to make sure I wasn't self-harming. They tried to calm me down and told me that the woman was having her meds adjusted and being transferred off the floor. "Great," Kyle replied. "I'll think about it then. I need to get Monaco batty." I didn't see her again for the rest of my visit. But then again, it was a psych ward. There were a lot of patients who just sat in their beds staring at nothing. And should we apologize? Cora wondered. She turned to the drums. Nix turned to where the compass flashed again. As a paramedic, I responded to a call of a traffic accident. Baby ejected. We prepared for the worst we could imagine. I arrive in about 8 minutes, and the trooper on the scene was trying to clean in the area of the bystanders and the gawkers and preserve the scene. I sat in the back and waited. He'd covered the baby with the yellow death sheet troopers carry in their trunks. I lifted the sheet to check vitals and pronounced death. And it was not a baby. It was the top half of the 19-year-old girl that was driving the small pickup truck about 50 yards away. She was driving and arguing with her 19-year-old husband, who was the passenger. They were doing about 55 miles per hour on a 2-lane road and met an oncoming truck pulling a double-wide mobile home. She ran under the front corner of the mobile home, cutting her in half. Her bottom half remained in the driver's seat, while her unhurt husband watched as the truck skidded another 50 to 60 yards, sideswiping a minivan, sending it into the ditch upside down. "Hush!" shouted Claudia. "I'll let Will back from her errand." When the truck came to rest, her bottom half fell out on the ground. We also found a trail of ribs from the cab to the bed and down the pavement to the top half. It looked like a movie set. Her top and bottom looked unhurt, but from mid-chest to about pelvis was strung along the road. The face bloaters ran their hands along the road. The husband was absolutely freaking out about what he had just seen. He was babbling incoherently, running around, swinging at people, just a mess. A witness who lived right in front of the scene started having chest pains and had to be transported. We took the husband and I called a medical control and actually got orders to give him an IV Valium, something paramedics normally can only give for grand mal seizures. The driver of the big truck was fine, but was also very, very distraught at what he had just witnessed. He came out of it and took off like a sailor. Afterwards, the driver of the big truck was fine, but was also very, very distraught. That was 16 years ago, and I can still remember pulling up at the scene like it was yesterday. We're a nurse here. This is kind of a long one. I was taking a call one night and woke up at 2 in the morning for a general surgery call. It was pretty vague, but at the time I lived in a town that had large populations of young military guys and avid meth users, so late-night emergencies were common. I got to the hospital where a few more details awaited me. Pararectal abscess. For the uninitiated, this means that somewhere in the immediate vicinity of the asshole, there was a pocket of pus that needed draining. Needless to say, our entire crew was less than thrilled. The hall was now a tangle, a convolute solution for muscle scars, working ever harder to deny them the commendation. I went down to the emergency room to transport the patient, and the only thing the RR nurse said as she handed me the chart was, "Have fun with this one." Amongst healthcare professionals, vague statements like that are a bad sign. My patient was a 314-pound Native American woman who barely fit on the stretcher I was transporting her on. She was rolling frantically, side to side, moaning in pain, pulling at her clothes and muttering Hail Marys. I could barely get her name out of her after a few minutes of questioning. So, after I confirmed her identity and what we were working on, I figured it was best just to get her to an anesthesiologist so we could knock her out and get this circus started. She continued her theatrics the entire 10-minute ride to the OR, nearly falling off the surgical table as we were trying to put her under anesthetic. We see patients like this a lot though. Chronic drug abusers who don't handle pain well and who have used so many drugs that, even in case levels of pain medication don't touch, simply because of high tolerance levels. It should be noted, tonight's surgical team was not exactly wet behind the ears. I'd been working in healthcare for several years already, mostly psych and medical settings. I've watched an 88-year-old man tear a 1-diameter catheter balloon out of his penis while screaming, "You'll never make me talk." I've been attacked by an HIV-positive neo-Nazi, and I've seen some shit. The other nurse had been in the OR as a trauma specialist for over 10 years. The anesthesiologist had done residency at a level 1 trauma center, or as we called them, knife and gun clubs. The surgeon was ex-Army and averaged about 8 words and 2 facial expressions a week. None of us expected what was about to happen next. A hunk of corpse came swinging up out of the trauma center. Now I could see the scars. We got the lady off to sleep and put her into stirrups. I began washing off the rectal area. It was red and inflamed, and a little bit of pus was seeping through, but it was all pretty standard. Her chart had noted that she'd been injecting IV drugs through her perineum, so this was obviously an infection from dirty needles or bad drugs. But overall, it didn't seem to warrant her repeated cries of, "Oh shit, kill me now." The surgeon steps up with a scalpel and sinks just the tip in. And at the exact same moment, the patient had a muscle twitch in her diaphragm, and just like that, all hell broke loose. The color, unbeknownst to us, the infection had actually tunneled nearly a foot into her abdomen, creating a vast cavern full of pus, rotten tissue, and fecal matter that had seeped outside of her colon. This godforsaken mixture came rocketing out of that little incision, like we were recreating the funeral scene from Jane Austen's Mafia. We all wear waterproof gowns, face masks, gloves, hats, the works, all of which were as helpful as rain boots against a fire hose. The bed was in the middle of the room, an easy 7 feet from the nearest wall, but by the time we were done, I was still finding bits of rotten flesh pasted against the back wall. As the surgeon continued to advance his blade, the torrent just continued. The patient kept seizing against the ventilator, not uncommon in surgery, and with every muscle contraction, she shot more of this blackish gray-brown fluid out onto the floor until, within minutes, it was seeping into the other nurse's shoes. I was nearly 12 feet away, jaw dropped open with my surgical mask, watching the second nurse dry heaving and the surgeon standing on tippy toes to keep his stuff from soaking his socks any further. The smell hit them first. Oh shit. I just threw up in my mask. Now this buggy. The other nurse was out. She tore off her mask and sprinted out of the room, shoulders still heaving. Then it hit me, mouth still wide open, not able to believe the volume of fluid this woman's body contained. It was like getting a great big bite of the despair and apathy that permeated this woman's life. I couldn't fucking breathe. My lungs simply refused to pull any more of that stuff in. The anesthesiologist went down next, an ex-sensory AA Don tailback, his 6'2" frame shaking as he threw open the door to the OR suite in an attempt to get more air, letting me glimpse the second nurse, still throwing up in the sink outside the door. Another geyser of pus splashed across the front of the surgeon. The YouTube clip of David at the dentist keeps playing in my mind. Is this real life? In all operating rooms everywhere in the world, regardless of socialized or privatized, secular or religious, big or small, there is this one thing the same. Somewhere, there is a bottle of peppermint concentrate. Everyone in the department knows where it is. Everyone knows what it's for, and everyone prays to their gods that they never have to use it. In times like this, we rub it on the inside of our masks to keep the outside smells at bay long enough to finish the procedure and shower off. I sprinted to our central supply, ripping open the drawer where this vial of ambrosia was kept, and was greeted by an empty fucking box. The bottle had been emptied and not replaced. Somewhere out there was a godless bastard who had used this last bit of peppermint oil and not replaced a single fucking drop of it. I opened the sliding drawer with his permission and folded no energy. Let's go get her. To this day, if I figure out who it was, I'll kill them with my bare hands. But not before cramming their head up the colon of every last meth user I can find, just so we're even. I darted back into the room with the next best thing I could find, a vial of Mastazole, which is an adhesive rub we use sometimes for bandaging. What's the Mastazole for? Alex whispered, jabbing me in the chest. The elevator shaft. Where to this one? It's not as good as peppermint, but considering that over 1/3 of the floor was now thoroughly coated in what could easily be mistaken for a combination of bovine afterbirth and maple syrup, we were out of options. I started rubbing as much of the Mastazole as I could get on the inside of my mask, just glad to be smelling anything except whatever slimy demon spawn we had just cut out of this woman. The anesthesiologist grabbed the vial next, dousing the front of his mask in it so he could just stand next to the machines long enough to make sure this woman didn't die on the table. It wasn't until later we realized that Mastazole can give you a mild high from huffing it like this, but in retrospect, it's probably what got us through. By this time, the smell had permeated out of our OR suite and down the 40-foot hallway to the front desk, where the other nurse still sat, eyes bloodshot and watery, clenching her stomach desperately. Our suite looked like the underground river of ooze from Ghostbusters 2, except dirty. Oh, so dirty. I stepped back into the OR suite, not wanting to leave the surgeon by himself in case he genuinely needed help. It was like one of those overly artistic representations of a zombie apocalypse you see on fan forums. Here's this one guy in a blue surgical garb, standing nearly ankle deep in lumps of dead tissue, fecal matter, and several liters of syrupy infection. Here! He was performing surgery in the swamp, except the swamps had just come out of this woman's arse and there was no Yoda. He and I didn't say a word for the next 10 minutes as he scraped the inside of the abscess until all of the dead tissue was out. The front of his gown a gruesome mixture of brown and red. His eyes squinted against the stinging vapors originating directly in front of him. I finished my required paperwork as quickly as I could, helped him stuff the recently vacated opening full of gauze, taped this woman's buttocks closed to hold the dressing for as long as possible, woke her up, and immediately shipped off to the recovery ward. Until then, I'd only heard of alcohol showers. Turns out, 70% of this stuff is about the only thing that can even touch a scent like that once it's soaked into your skin. It takes 4 or 5 bottles to get really clean, but it's worth it. It's probably the only scenario I can honestly endorse drinking a little bit of it, too. As we left the locker room, the surgeon and I looked at each other, and he said the only negative sentence I heard him utter in 2.5 years of working together. That was bad. Still, it's only another dragon. I actually want to know what he thinks of the country. I shall expect a minimal quantity of soul water over the next few weeks. The next morning, the entire department, a fairly large floor within the hospital, still smelled. The housekeepers told me later that it took them nearly an hour to suction up all of the fluid and debris left behind. The OR suite itself was closed off, and quarantine for 2 more days, just to let the smell finally clear out. I laugh now when I hear recruits to healthcare talk about the worst thing they've seen. You ain't seen shit, kid. G'day mates, it's Bee-Buster here. So the Beehive is almost reaching a milestone of 500 zero strong, guys. It never ceases to amaze me just how much support you guys all give me and how quickly this channel is growing. Thank you all so much for everything that you're doing for me. I also want to give a huge shout out to Erin Frost for putting together the thumbnail for this video. She's got some amazing talent and has gone above and beyond to assist me here. And so I've provided a link in the description to her Tumblr account and Facebook page so that you guys can go check out her work and show her some love. Once again, guys, thank you for all of your support. It's just amazing to see how quickly this channel is growing, and it's all thanks to you guys. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do. And as always, guys, make sure you share and like the video, as this is the way you guys support the channel and it helps to continue to grow the channel. Let's dive into next story, The Silent Wing. The St. Augustine Asylum for the Mentally Ill had long been abandoned, its sprawling structure left to decay on the outskirts of town. Built in the late 1800s, it had seen its share of tragedy. Overcrowded wards, questionable treatments, and rumors of malpractice had sealed its fate, but not before it earned the nickname, the House of Whispers. Its most infamous feature was the Silent Wing, a section of the hospital where the most disturbed patients were kept. The wing had been sealed off years before the asylum's closure, with stories of what occurred there shrouded in mystery and fear. Despite its haunted reputation, the asylum became a magnet for urban explorers, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers. None stayed long, often citing an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to seep from the walls. Among these explorers was Emily Carter, a rising star in the online paranormal community. She had built her channel by delving into the world's most haunted places, and St. Augustine was the perfect target. Emily arrived late in the afternoon, the setting sun casting long shadows across the asylum's crumbling facade. The air was thick with decay, the scent of mildew and rot wafting from broken windows. She adjusted her camera, her voice steady as she narrated. This is St. Augustine Asylum, a place where countless souls met untimely ends. Tonight, we'll explore its darkest corner, the Silent Wing. The main building was eerily silent, save for the crunch of debris underfoot. Peeling paint hung like cobwebs from the walls, and rusted gurneys sat abandoned in dark hallways. Emily moved carefully, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. Every creak and distant drip of water set her nerves on edge, but she pressed on, documenting her journey. On the way to the next containment, she stopped to slow down, smelling the germ zone. It wasn't long before she found the entrance to the Silent Wing. A heavy iron door, its surface marred with deep scratches, stood ajar. A faded sign above it read, Ward C. Emily hesitated, her confidence wavering. The air felt colder here, oppressive, as if the building itself was warning her to turn back. She swallowed hard and stepped through the threshold. The atmosphere changed immediately. The Silent Wing was darker, the walls covered in strange markings that looked hastily scrawled. Some were words, others symbols Emily couldn't decipher. The whispers started soon after, faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind. She paused, shining her flashlight around. "Did you hear that?" she whispered into the camera, her voice trembling. As she ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls. Emily's flashlight flickered, and she froze. "Come on," she muttered, smacking it. When it steadied, she caught movement in the corner of her eye. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. "Hello?" she called, her voice thin. There was no response, only the whispers, now forming fragmented sentences. "Why are you here? They're watching. Don't look behind you." Emily's pulse quickened. She forced herself to laugh. "Classic haunted house stuff," she said. though her voice lacked conviction. She continued forward, her flashlight revealing door after door, each with a small reinforced window. Most were cracked or smeared with grime, but one was clear. Emily peered inside, her breath catching in her throat. The girl was sitting on the room was empty save for a single chair bolted to the floor. Straps dangled from its arms and legs, and dark stains marred the seat. As Emily stared, she thought she saw movement in the corner of the room, a shadow, darker than the rest. She blinked, and it was gone. On the ground, Kavor. That's not something that should have happened. Her camera began to malfunction, the screen distorting with static. No, 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 she muttered, fiddling with it. The whispers escalated, now a chorus of overlapping voices, some screaming, others sobbing. Emily's heart pounded as she realized the voices were speaking directly to her. Her heart raced. You shouldn't be here. A sudden deafening slam made her jump. She turned to see the iron door at the entrance had shut, the sound reverberating through the wing. Panic set in as she sprinted back the way she came, but the hallway seemed endless, twisting and shifting as if the building itself were alive. She stumbled into a large room, her flashlight revealing rows of rusted beds. Straps hung limply from their frames, and more of the strange symbols covered the walls. In the center of the room stood a figure, its back to her. It was tall and emaciated, its skin a sickly gray. It turned slowly, its hollow eyes meeting hers. Emily screamed, dropping her camera as the figure lunged toward her. The last thing the camera recorded was her terrified face, the screen going black as her scream echoed through the silent wing. Jason held Claire and Annie's hand as I screamed at. When Emily didn't return home the next day, her friend and fellow content creator Josh grew concerned. She'd told him her plan and had even promised to check in once the shoot was over. When hours turned into days, Josh decided to investigate. Armed with his own camera and a flashlight, he retraced her steps to St. Augustine Asylum. The building loomed larger than he'd imagined, its broken windows staring like dead eyes. He felt a chill run down his spine as he approached the silent wing. The iron door stood ajar, just as Emily had found it. He hesitated, his mind racing with the story she'd told him. "This is for Emily," he whispered, stepping inside. The air grew heavy as he ventured deeper. The same whispers Emily had described began almost immediately. "Emily?" he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. The whispers seemed to mock him, repeating his words in distorted tones. He pressed on, his flashlight illuminating the eerie markings on the walls. Josh found Emily's camera lying on the ground, its casing cracked. He picked it up, flipping through the footage. The static-riddled recording sent a shiver through him, but it was the final clip that made his blood run cold. Emily's terrified face filled the frame, her scream cutting off abruptly before the screen went black. Something moved in the shadows ahead, a fleeting glimpse of a figure. "Emily?" Josh called again, his voice shaking. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic. He turned to leave, but the hallway had changed, just as it had for Emily. Every path led him deeper into the wing. He stumbled into the same room Emily had found, the rusted beds and strange symbols eerily familiar. A single word was scrawled on the wall, dripping as if freshly written: "Leave." The hidden M words missed across the blue art, making it seem like a symbol Emily recognized, but with higher stranger. A leave corresponds to the character's name. A leave corresponds. He stumbled into the same room Emily had found, the rusted beds and services. Across from his wife's bed was a hoard symbol of living death. Before he could react, the room filled with the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. The emaciated figure emerged, its hollow eyes locking onto him. Josh backed away, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The whispers turned to screams, and he bolted, leaving the camera and any hope of answers behind. Josh managed to escape the asylum, collapsing on the ground outside. He never spoke of what he saw, but he abandoned his channel and moved far from town. The footage from Emily's camera was uploaded anonymously weeks later, sparking renewed interest in the asylum. Thrill seekers flocked to the site, but none who entered the silent wing ever returned. Hunt laughed audibly. Hunter snorted. "Finally, how should I start my mind of telling you?" Locals still warn against venturing near St. Augustine Asylum. They say the whispers never stop, and if you're not careful, you'll join the countless souls lost within its cursed walls. Let's dive into next story. Maya is a struggling freelance journalist with a focus on investigative reporting, particularly urban legends and abandoned places. She's chasing a story to sell to a major publication. St. Dimphinus Asylum has a dark reputation. Local legends attribute mysterious disappearances and bizarre occurrences to its ruins, but these rumors could be explained by logical causes, such as structural instability, urban decay, or squatters. Maya plans the trip with two friends, Jake, a thrill seeker with a love for paranormal documentaries, and Tyler, a reserved photographer with a knack for debunking myths. Now, realistic setup. St. Dimphinus history includes real-world issues like overcrowding, underfunding, and unethical medical practices, lobotomies, electroshock therapy. The asylum closed after a fire in the East Wing killed several staff and patients, with allegations of arson, cover-ups, and patient mistreatment. Atmospheric buildup. The group's journey to the asylum is fraught with unease. They encounter warnings from locals, poor weather, and a sense of isolation. They enter the asylum with basic gear, flashlights, cameras, a recorder, and masks to protect from mold and dust. Exploration and unease. The asylum is described in vivid, haunting detail. Peeling paint, crumbling ceilings, outdated medical equipment, and graffiti from previous trespassers. The stone floor creaks under us, and crackles of brush with each other. The smell from the engine slowly wafting up, making Yates sick skull. His head slid from side to side, and he frantically shakes it, clinging to the mess of clothing. The group finds old patient files, including accounts of experimental treatments for schizophrenia, depression, and hysteria. These cases hint at severe human rights violations. Irrationally ambiguous events. Strange occurrences begin, such as faint footsteps, flickering flashlights, and distant banging noises. These could be attributed to environmental factors, wind, unstable structures, animals, or heightened anxiety. Tyler starts feeling watched and claims to see shadows moving, but Jake dismisses it as nerves, not because there's no monster around anymore, but because it's overkill. They had snuck up and watched them watch. Character reactions. The group begins to fracture under stress. Jake's bravado clashes with Tyler's growing paranoia, while Maya tries to maintain control and document the experience. Subtle signs of psychological manipulation, distorted perceptions of time, increasing irritability, and feelings of disorientation. Hidden layers of history. The group discovers a locked room containing preserved files and journals, including notes from Dr. Marlowe, the asylum's head psychiatrist. The notes described controversial experiments to cure mental illness by isolating patients from sensory input, clarified the long-held assumption that a modern mind can't solve problems such as mental illness by isolating patients from sensory input. They also find a diagram of an underground tunnel system, hinting that some patients and staff may have tried to escape during the fire. Heightened tension. The group decides to explore the tunnels but gets lost in the maze-like corridors. The oppressive darkness and dampness intensify their anxiety. The survivors look for Halsey in despair, but find her in the corridors. Maya begins to feel strange sensations, like hearing faint voices when the others speak. The voices repeat fragments of Dr. Marlowe's notes. The mind is its own worst enemy. Rational explanations and doubt. Tyler hypothesizes that the sensations are caused by toxic mold or chemical residues from the fire. which could induce hallucinations. Jake pushes for more exploration, while Maya becomes torn between her journalistic curiosity and a growing sense of danger. Group dynamics collapse. The group starts turning on each other as paranoia sets in. Tyler accuses Jake of staging some of the noises and shadows to scare them. Maya struggles to mediate, but feels her own grip on reality slipping. They hear a sound that cannot be ignored. The distinct voice of a woman crying, "Help me!" Rational fear versus supernatural ambiguity. Maya rationalizes that they may have stumbled upon a squatter or another explorer in distress. But when they follow the sound, they find an old padded room with no one inside. Just a patient's scratched writing on the wall. They hear everything. So Shorts things off towards the deck, but finds Long Girl by the grave with no one around it. It's like someone took the dust from under the feet. Perhaps. It took on a Glond and assumed the magic could help it live. Confrontation with the past. The group finds evidence that some staff knew about the fire before it happened and deliberately locked patients inside to protect themselves. The guilt and desperation of these events seem to linger in the atmosphere. As they attempt to leave, the asylum seems to trap them. Hallways appear to shift, but this could be due to panic-induced disorientation. Breaking point. Jake disappears while exploring on his own. Maya and Tyler search frantically, but only find his camera, with footage showing Jake seemingly talking to someone who isn't there. Annihilus Asaeth swarms over Jake, ready to take over if he sets foot on Earth again. Maya and Tyler's descent into the tunnels reveal signs of structural collapse. They narrowly avoid being crushed, further escalating their desperation. The final escape. The pair stumbles upon a room filled with personal belongings of former patients, including letters that were never sent. These items humanize the asylum's victims, grounding the horror in reality. They escape the asylum just as dawn breaks. Maya looks back to see no sign of Jake or the windows they had entered through, raising the question of whether their experience was entirely real. On the surface, it feels like they're having a dream. Maya publishes an article about the asylum, but focuses on its historical abuses rather than the paranormal. She continues to be haunted by the experience, her dreams filled with the whispers of the past. The story ends with a hint of ambiguity. Maya receives an anonymous email containing a picture of Jake standing in one of the asylum's corridors, taken weeks after their visit. The dive into next story. There was an unspoken rule among the staff at St. Mercy's Hospital. Never go near the West Wing after dark. Officially, it was sealed off years ago due to structural concerns. Unofficially, it was a different story. One whispered in break rooms and hallways, a tale of unexplained occurrences and unsettling events. It all began when Amanda, a new night nurse, was assigned to inventory the old medical equipment stored in the adjacent wing. She'd heard the rumors, but dismissed them as urban legends. Hospitals were inherently eerie at night, she reasoned. Empty halls, dim lights, and the ever-present hum of machinery were enough to make anyone uneasy. Her task was straightforward: catalog items and ensure they were ready for donation or disposal. Armed with a flashlight, clipboard, and a determination to get it over with, Amanda pushed open the door separating the active hospital from the abandoned wing. The air changed immediately. It was colder, carrying the scent of mildew and rust. Her flashlight beam cut through the dust-filled air, revealing forgotten gurneys, overturned chairs, and outdated medical equipment. As she moved further in, the oppressive silence became almost unbearable. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the walls absorbed the sound and distorted it. The first hour was uneventful, though she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She told herself it was just nerves. Hospitals, especially abandoned ones, had a way of playing tricks on the mind. While documenting an old defibrillator, Amanda heard a faint noise, a soft shuffle, like footsteps. She froze, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. There was no reply. She shook her head and laughed nervously. It was probably a rat or a draft moving debris. Souvenirs goddess. But the noises persisted. A whisper here, a scrape there. They seemed to follow her, growing louder and more insistent. Determined to finish her work, Amanda pushed through, though her hands trembled with each line she wrote on the inventory sheet. Then she reached room 315. The door was slightly ajar, something she hadn't noticed earlier. Inside, the room was oddly clean compared to the rest of the wing. The bed was made, the equipment dust-free, and the faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. It was as though the room was still in use. A sudden chill swept over her, and Amanda's flashlight flickered. When it steadied, she noticed a detail she hadn't seen before. A faint smear of something dark on the floor, leading to the bed. A sense of unease gripped her as she approached the bed. That's when she saw it. The clipboard slipped from her hands as her flashlight illuminated the faint imprint of a hand on the wall near the headboard. The outline was small, almost childlike, and looked freshly made. Amanda staggered back, her breath hitching. She turned to leave, but as she did, she heard it. A low, guttural sigh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her scream echoed through the wing as she ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly. Her colleagues found her moments later, incoherent and trembling. When she finally calmed down, she tried to explain what had happened, but her story was met with skepticism. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving the wing, and the handprint she described was gone when the maintenance team investigated. To me, it felt like an unnatural flight, as the windows were open and a downy prince-sized one. After her resignation, Amanda's story circulated among the hospital staff. Some dismissed it as stress-induced hysteria, while others took it as confirmation of the old rumors. But the tale didn't end there. A few months later, Tom, a maintenance worker, was sent to repair a water leak that had spread to the sealed-off West Wing. Tom was a pragmatic man, not one for ghost stories. Armed with tools and a work light, he pried open the sealed door and stepped inside. The cold hit him first, followed by the heavy, oppressive air. The faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. As he worked to locate the source of the leak, Tom's flashlight began to flicker. He cursed under his breath, tapping it to bring the beam back to life. It was then he noticed something unusual. The hallway, which had been empty moments ago, now had wet footprints leading away from the puddle he was fixing. The footprints were small, like those of a child. Tom followed the trail, muttering about practical jokes and kids sneaking in where they didn't belong. The footprints led to room 315. The door, slightly ajar, creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the room was as Amanda had described, eerily clean, with a faint scent of antiseptic. On the bed lay an old, faded hospital bracelet. Tom picked it up, squinting at the name etched on it. Elizabeth, age 8. Chill ran down his spine as he heard a faint giggle, high-pitched and echoing. He spun around, but the room was empty. The giggle turned into a soft, pleading whisper. "Help me." Tom dropped the bracelet and bolted, leaving his tools and work light behind. He reported the leak as fixed and refused to return to the West Wing. The bracelet was never found when another worker was sent to retrieve the abandoned equipment. From that day forward, the West Wing was avoided even during the day. Staff reported hearing faint whispers and footsteps, and some claimed to see the shadow of a small figure darting between the broken furniture. The hospital administration decided to seal the wing permanently, but the stories persisted. To this day, those who walked near the West Wing swear they could hear a child's voice, soft and sorrowful, calling for help from behind the locked doors. Hospitals have their share of strange stories, but St. Mary's Psychiatric Hospital had one that chilled even the most skeptical of minds. The legend of patient 246-1, Rebecca Monroe, was the kind of tale that doctors and nurses whispered about in the dead of night. Let's dive into last story before starting it. Kindly like the video and share your story with us in the comments. The hospital, perched on a hill overlooking a desolate town, had been operational for decades. Its walls held the secrets of countless tragedies, but none more disturbing than Rebecca's case, and none more haunting than the one doctor who'd tried to save her. Dr. Eleanor Hayes arrived at St. Mary's with an air of optimism. A skilled psychiatrist with a passion for unraveling the human mind, she believed in healing the broken. But she was also pragmatic, knowing some patients required more than just therapy. They needed someone to fight for them. Rebecca Monroe was assigned to her on her third week. The patient's file was thin, lacking the usual history. She had been brought in after being found wandering in the rain near an old cemetery. When questioned, Rebecca would only repeat one phrase: "He's watching. He's always watching." Dr. Hayes dismissed it as paranoia, a symptom of trauma, but the staff avoided Rebecca like the plague, whispering rumors about strange occurrences in her ward. Lights would flicker, doors would slam. Some even claimed to hear a man's voice humming an unsettling melody late at night. The first session with Rebecca was unnerving. The patient was gaunt, her pale skin stretched tightly over her bones. Her eyes, wide and glassy, seemed to pierce right through Dr. Hayes. A quick check determined her heart rate was a little higher than normal. "Rebecca, I'm Dr. Hayes. I'm here to help you," she began. Rebecca tilted her head slightly, as though listening to something only she could hear. "He doesn't like you," she whispered. "Who doesn't like me?" Rebecca's gaze darted to the corner of the room. Dr. Hayes felt a shiver crawl down her spine. "Can you tell me about him?" But Rebecca remained silent, her hands clasped tightly as though in prayer. Dr. Hayes began noticing odd occurrences during her sessions with Rebecca. The air in the room always seemed colder, no matter how warm the rest of the hospital was. Papers on her desk would flutter even when the windows were closed. In 1989, Dr. Hayes got especially bitter, which gradually became physical activity on her feet. Today, her injuries are becoming more and more frequent. It's hard not to notice something's off. And then there was the humming. I felt it. It began faintly, just a low, tuneless melody that seemed to come from nowhere. The sound grew louder when Rebecca spoke of the man in the mask. One evening, as Dr. Hayes reviewed her notes at home, she heard the same humming coming from her living room. Grabbing a flashlight, she crept downstairs. The room was empty, but a single piece of paper lay on the floor. Scrawled on it in shaky handwriting were the words, "He sees you too." Among the staff at Ravenswood was a doctor named Victor Crane, infamous for his experiments on vulnerable patients. He believed in transferring consciousness, using his victims to test his theories. His signature? A porcelain mask he wore to protect his identity. Crane disappeared after Ravenswood's closure, and the authorities never found his laboratory. Dr. Hayes pressed Rebecca for more details. Slowly, the patient began to unravel her story. She claimed to have been a patient at a place she called the Hollow. "They took us there," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. "He said we were special. He said we would live forever," Rebecca said as she searched her brain. "He said we would live forever? And then Mr. Sum have someone go look for Pedrosa's coffin," Obaba said. "They said we would live forever. And then Mr. Sum pressed a sifter." "Oh, the man in the mask," she replied. "He took pieces of us, our memories, our fears. He put them in the walls." Dr. Hayes leaned forward. "Rebecca, you're safe now. He can't hurt you." But Rebecca only shook her head. "He doesn't need to. He's already here. The hospital's basement had always been off limits. Staff said it was unsafe, filled with debris from the old asylum. But Rebecca's words haunted Dr. Hayes, and late one night, she decided to explore. Armed with a flashlight, she descended the creaking stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the humming returned, louder and more distinct. Fewer and fewer people found their way down the stairs, and she wanted to keep searching. There was no other exit. At the end of the hallway, she found a door. Rusted shut, it took all her strength to pry it open. Inside was a room that seemed frozen in time. A chair sat in the center, its leather straps cracked with age. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of unidentifiable substances, and on the desk lay a porcelain mask. As Dr. Hayes reached for the mask, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. Turning, she saw a figure standing there, its face obscured by the mask. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice hollow and echoing. To her, Dr. Hayes stumbled backward. "Who are you?" "I am everywhere," it replied. "I am in her mind. I am in yours." The figure stepped closer, and Dr. Hayes froze. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The mask tilted slightly, as though studying her. In the background, she heard the grunts of the people elsewhere, added suddenly to the "She belongs to me," it whispered. The next thing Dr. Hayes knew, she was back in her office, clutching Rebecca's file. The mask was gone, but the humming lingered in her ears. Rebecca was waiting for her in the ward. "You saw him," she said simply. Dr. Hayes nodded. "Rebecca, we have to leave this place." But before they could act, the lights in the hospital flickered, alarms blared, and the walls seemed to pulse with energy. The humming grew deafening, and shadows moved unnaturally in the corridors. One by one, the staff disappeared, their screams echoing through the halls. Dr. Hayes and Rebecca barricaded themselves in the office. The humming stopped, replaced by silence. "He's here," Rebecca whispered. The door burst open, and the masked man entered. His movements were slow, deliberate. "You wanted to help her," he said to Dr. Hayes. "Now you'll join her." As the man reached for her, Rebecca stepped forward. "Take me," she said. "Let her go." The man hesitated before nodding. A fair trade. Rebecca disappeared that night, along with the masked man. The hospital was shut down, its staff unable to explain the events. Dr. Hayes left psychiatry, haunted by what she had seen, but she couldn't escape the nightmares. Every night, she heard the humming, and every night, the mask appeared at the foot of her bed. Sometimes, she woke to find Halsey standing over her and seemed to be insisting that she call for an update. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Please like, share, and comment, and subscribe the channel. Thank you.